Imagine being trapped inside a city with almost nothing left to eat. Outside the walls, an enemy army is waiting. Inside, people are starving. And sitting near the city gate are four men who have nowhere to go. This is the strange and powerful story of four outcasts who walked into an enemy camp expecting to die, only to discover that thousands of soldiers had mysteriously disappeared. At the time, the city of Samaria was surrounded by the Aramean army. No one could easily enter. No one could easily leave. As the siege continued, food became extremely scarce, and the people inside the city became desperate. But outside the city gate sat four men with leprosy. Because of their condition, they lived apart from the rest of society. They were already suffering. Now they were starving too. Eventually, the four men looked at their situation and asked a simple question. Why should we sit here until we die? They had only a few choices. If they entered the starving city, they would probably die there. If they stayed where they were, they would also die. But there was one more possibility. They could go to the camp of the Arameans. Maybe the enemy soldiers would spare them and give them food. And if the soldiers killed them, they were already facing death anyway. So as evening approached, the four men began walking toward the enemy camp. They probably expected guards, soldiers, weapons, maybe even death. But when they reached the edge of the camp, something was wrong. It was quiet. Too quiet. They entered one of the tents. No soldiers. They looked inside another. Still no one. The entire camp had been abandoned, but the soldiers had left almost everything behind. Food, drink, clothing, silver, gold. Even their animals and equipment remained. It looked as if an entire army had suddenly become terrified and fled without taking time to gather their belongings. And according to the Bible, that is exactly what happened. God had caused the Aramean army to hear the sound of chariots, horses, and what seemed to be a massive approaching army. The soldiers became convinced that the king of Israel had hired powerful armies to attack them. Panic spread through the camp. They didn't wait to find out whether the army was real. They ran. They abandoned their tents. They abandoned their horses. They abandoned their possessions. They even left their food behind. They fled for their lives. But the four men knew none of this when they first arrived. All they knew was that they had just walked into an empty camp filled with everything they desperately needed. So they entered a tent. They ate. They drank. Then they found silver, gold, and clothing. They took some of it away and hid it. Then they returned and collected more. For men who had been starving only hours earlier, it must have felt unbelievable. But then something changed. They realized that while they were eating, an entire city was still starving behind them. They said to one another, "What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves." That realization changed everything. Instead of continuing to collect treasure for themselves, they returned to Samaria. They went to the city gate and told the guards what they had discovered. "We went into the Aramean camp," they explained, "and no one was there. No soldiers, no voices, just abandoned tents, animals, and supplies. At first, the king of Israel was suspicious. He thought it might be a trap. Perhaps the Arameans were hiding somewhere nearby, waiting for the starving Israelites to leave the safety of the city. So the king sent men to investigate. They followed the road toward the Jordan River, and along the way, they saw evidence of a panicked escape. Clothing and equipment had been thrown aside as the Aramean soldiers fled. The report was true. The enemy was gone. When the people of Samaria heard the news, they rushed out of the city and entered the abandoned camp. Suddenly, the food that had been almost impossible to obtain became plentiful. The siege was broken. The famine began to end. And an entire city received good news because 4 rejected men decided not to keep what they had discovered to themselves. That's what makes this story so remarkable. The heroes were not kings. They were not generals. They were not powerful warriors. They were 4 men sitting outside the city, rejected by society and seemingly without hope. Yet they became the first people to discover that the enemy had fled, and they became the ones who carried the news back to everyone else. Their story leaves us with a simple but powerful lesson. Sometimes, hope can arrive through the people we least expect. And when we receive something good that could save or help others, it shouldn't always stop with us. The 4 men entered the darkness believing they might find death. Instead, they found an empty enemy camp, food for a starving city, and good news that was simply too important to keep to themselves.